a Grub bootloader, I've got Elementary, I've got Kali, and then we have Windows Boot Manager. Because it was cloned, the same exact boot entry that worked for the SSD, even though this is on one of the other SSDs, works for this, because the UUID is the same. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. That UUID will really screw you up. Even if you took this Angel and what's that utility that you like?
Aomi.
Oh,
Backup.
Iomi, yeah. If you take an Iomi to clone that drive and put it in here, this boot menu would no longer work on Windows Boot Manager because the new disk would have a different UUID.
Oh, I see, okay.
What does UUID stand for?
User interface.
No.
Universally unique identifier.
Universally unique identifier, right?
Awesome.
Is universal, what is it?
Universally unique identifier. So bear with this because this is a hard drive and I'm just not used to it.
So it's
We used to solid state boot already.
UUID, yeah. You can reset your UUID using certain utilities. Occasionally I've had to do that. Not often, but I have definitely done that in the past. And it can be a risky process. You only do it if you need to do it. Yeah.
Wow.
Like for example, like let's say you're making money on Craigslist for a living, flipping computers, and you have a business model of one certain machine. It's got a profile of what's that word? That's go there. It's got a profile that works. So you've got, let's say you went to a school surplus or a library surplus store and you bought, 30 or 40 Dell Optiplex 9010s, and then you created a master disk image for that, or a master disk that worked with all the hardware, because all the hardware is the same, right? Drivers and all that.
Okay.
And you got one of those cloners, and you cloned it to 20 disks. So now you got 20 boot disks. You're going to want to go in there and change the UUIDs on each one of those. Otherwise, you could run into problems.
Like what? What's the problem?
Well, the chances that are remote if you're selling those computers, because people aren't going to be on the same local networks. But if by chance they did happen to be, if I had two computers on the same LAN that had the same UUID, and I had any kind of file sharing or networking going on, it won't work. It's going to run into problems.
Okay. Can they identify bootleg disks as well, and then charge you for unauthorized distribution of software or something like that?
Can who recognize?
If anybody's like doing like a investigation or something like that, they can identify multiple boot. Because isn't ARC operating systems or whatever software illegal to multiply without proper?
So you're talking about if you actually authorized one of the, so if you like legally bought one copy of Windows and then cloned it using that cloner 20 times, put it on 20 machines and then sold that?
Yeah.
Well, that actually, it won't be activated on any but the first machine that you did it on, because of the fact that it ties in, it looks at the hardware's serial number in order to activate. So as soon as you duplicate to the second machine, it's going to tell you to activate Windows. Now, if you use something like, well, there are other methods, to defeat Windows activation. You use one of those methods, then that would definitely be cloned over, and depending on what method you used, it may or may not be detectable. But I'm not going to give an instructional on piracy in here.
Sorry, Angel. Sorry.
I know, I was just about to ask.
Okay, so let's go to disk management. Let's just, actually the easiest way to get to this that I like is to right click here. Remember, this machine's a little slower, and click on disk management up here. Okay, so what do we have going on over here? There we go. Now here, let me just show you this first and see if I can. Now we see on disk 0, this is one of the 64 gig SSDs. It's offline because of a policy set by an administrator. I set that policy because I didn't want this disk to be mounted in Windows because it uses an ext4 file system. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so if we scroll down over here, we look at some of these other ones. So which one do you think is going to be the clone?
This too.
This two. So we see this is actually a 500 gig disk. Different machines are going to report that differently because of issues with binary conversion. You know, a kilobyte is 1024 bytes, but Windows likes to report them as 1,000. Mac OS reports them as 1024, so if you looked at the disk and Mac OS would say 500 gigabytes. Linux does the same thing. We come over here, we see our different partitions. So this is exactly how the SSD looked. It had its recovery, it had its EFI partition. You guys all know what that does, I hope. Then we've got our C drive. Now, cloning disks on Windows, I hate to do it using utilities like any other utilities, but just a drive cloner. On the Mac, I don't mind doing that at all. But if we're working in Windows, I really don't like cloning using other methods because of the fact that your EFI partition is it's pretty finicky in terms of the way it works. It works a little differently than it works on other platforms. And we can get into a little more depth on that. But let's just get through this. So we've got a basic disk, recovery 100, 233. So why do we have 232 gigabytes unallocated?
Because the other disk was bigger, wasn't it?
The other disk was smaller.
Right, the other disk was 256 gig, and this disk is 500. So what do we want to do here? So we have C drive, and that's 233. Do we want to expand our EFI partition? No. We only need about 5 megabytes for the EFI folder. Do we want to expand our recovery partition? No. What do we want to do?
Reformat,
We can expand our C drive. That's one option.
We can make a new drive.
partition it.
Or we can make a new partition on the 232. But, you just came in, but essentially we used a cloner to clone an SSD over to a 500 gig standard spinning disk. And so when you do that, it makes a sector by sector, block by block clone. And so it's however the other drive look, everything including the UUID is going to be identical. So what I would want to do here is not make a second partition because this machine is barely going to be used except for Kali, and this Windows installation may be used a little bit, but it'll probably be wiped later. So we're going to right click on C here, and we're going to go to extend volume. All right, so this is the extend volume wizard. Now, what file systems can we do this with on Windows?
NTFS?
NTFS. Can you do it on FAT32? No. So we're going to hit next. Now, if you leave it at defaults, it's going to expand the disk as much as it can to fill all unallocated space. Yeah, if you want to use the rest of the unallocated space, like if you just cloned a smaller disk to a larger disk using like that standalone cloner bay that you just looked at in the room over there, where you have the clone button and the two bays, clone a small disk to a bigger disk, you're going to end up with exactly this scenario. You want to go in there in the defaults and you can expand it to fill that unallocated space. Now, if you wanted to make other partitions, then you would not have to do that. Let me hit cancel for now. We could go to right click on unallocated space and we could create a new simple volume there and just have a separate partition there if we wanted. And I'm going to show you some other stuff we can do as well. But let's first extend the volume. Now let me take a look. Let's go first, just so you can see. Let's right-click on local disk, the properties, and take a look at this right here. So we have only 45 gigabytes of space used on the disk, and we have 187 gigabytes free, and it shows us that the capacity is 233, of course, it's NTFS. And this is, now you should know off the top of your head, is this legacy boot or UEFI boot?
It's a legacy boot.
Why?
You know?
Hmm?
Because it's not a graphical interface, right?
Yeah.
This is not a legacy boot.
No.
Why not? What one thing did we see that should indicate to you immediately that this is not a legacy boot? This is UEFI.
NTFS?
No.
Maybe the boot,
Oh, it's the boot size, right?
the boots.
The boot size is bigger. UEFI.
EFI, you said that? Oh.
Yeah, I said UEFI. Is it something about EFI?
EFI, the EFI partition. Remember that partition? Let me show you that again.
So the
This right here, boom. This EFI system partition. That should have indicated when I showed you that partition, you should have said, oh, okay, I got it. This is obviously UEFI boot. That's the extensible firmware interface system partition. That contains the EFI folder. The EFI folder is what the UEFI boot manager looks for in order to boot Windows. And it's called Windows Boot Manager. Now, if we don't use EFI boot, or UEFI boot, same thing, instead use legacy boot, then what are we looking for when we boot?
MBR.
The master boot record, yeah.
It's a certain partition scheme, right?
There you go.
Say MBR.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Say it louder.
They say MBR. Just looking for a master boot record.
You're looking for the master boot record. You're looking for the win boot on your master boot record. Right. So
So
that is
that-
that is legacy, and you want to try to avoid that if possible. If you are using Windows in legacy mode, the only real drawback to that, as long as you're not planning to dual boot other operating systems like Mac OS or Linux, if you're doing that, then you're going to have real problems because those you can't have a drive using legacy boot those unless you have highly customized bootloaders there. It would be a pain in the ass. But on this, if you have if you've got a let's see.
Like if you had another OS to boot from, is that what you tried to say?
Oh, no. I forgot my train of thought. So the only real drawback you would have by using legacy boot is the fact that you're not going to be able to mount any disks that are formatted using the GPT partition scheme.
Is it GPT?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big drawback. Like, for example, Maria just brought her laptop over here because she didn't have the ETE files on it. And I have a flash drive formatted FAT32 GPT. Plugged it in. This device needs to be formatted first. All right. So that probably wouldn't have happened if her system was set up with UEFI boot. And most modern systems can be. So that's the main, and now today, because more and more systems are UEFI boot, more drives are coming not formatted as MBR, but coming formatted GPT, especially SSDs, because it dramatically is going to increase your performance, so especially on removable disk. All right, so no one should forget that. EFI partition means you're booting EFI. No EFI partition means you're booting legacy.
So is the master boot record a partition scheme?
Yes, that is it's two things. It's a partition scheme, and it's also a record. This is part of the header on the disk that the system looks for at boot, in order to boot Windows. But if you're just looking at identifying partition schemes, yeah, MBR and GPT are your two main ones, and then you got APM, which is pretty seldom used. And then if you're looking at file systems, yeah, you can put numerous file systems on your different partitions on your disk, but you can only have one partition scheme per disk. Only GPT or MBR. Okay, so let's go ahead and extend the volume. Next, next, finish, done. All right, so now we got 465. So now we can go back down here. And now we see that we have 419 free space. All right, so, okay, now on shrinking up a partition. So with shrinking a partition, this can be really helpful if you're creating a toolkit. Because like, let's say you've got a external drive, and you want to be able to use that to boot into the installers for 20 different operating systems. So you want to be able to take this flash drive around, let's say it's a 64 gig or 128 gig flash drive, and you want to be able to use this flash drive to boot into 20 different OS installers. Let's say you want to be able to use it to boot into 20 different versions of Linux, or 20 different versions of Mac OS, or 20 different versions of Windows. So in order to do that, what you would need to do would be to create a disk image of your installers, and then you could just image the installer to your flash drive, which would be an NTFS. Then you could come down here and you could say shrink.